In a fortnight, I had got so used to the routine of a dishwasher's life that I could hardly imagine anything different. It was a life without much variation. At 5:45, one woke with a sudden start, tumbled into grease-stiffened clothes, and hurried out with dirty face and protesting muscles. It was dawn, and the windows were dark except for the workmen's cafes. The sky was like a vast, flat wall of cobalt, with roofs and spires of black paper pasted upon it. Drowsy men were sweeping the pavements with 10-foot besoms, and ragged families picking over the dustbins. Workmen, and girls with a piece of chocolate in one hand and a croissant in the other, were pouring into the metro stations. Trams, filled with more workmen, boomed gloomily past. One hastened down to the station, fought for a place. One literally does have to fight on the Paris metro at 6 in the morning, and stood jammed in the swaying mass of passengers, nose to nose with some hideous French face, breathing sour wine and garlic. And then one descended into the labyrinth of the hotel basement and forgot daylight till 2 o'clock, when the sun was hot and the town black with people and cars. What's up, party people, and welcome back to another episode of NYC Foodways, your weekly food and culture discussion from the cultural capital of the world. My name is John, and this week's episode is dedicated to Joanne Clevenger, Upper Line's doyenne of dining. This week on NYC Foodways, we turn the page to George Orwell's masterful memoir, Down and Out in Paris and London. I guess I could have called this episode Down in Paris, since we're only going to cover the first half of the book, but that doesn't quite have the same ring to it. George Orwell, born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903 in what was then British India, is best known to Americans by his works Animal Farm and 1984, often assigned to school children. And while both are of note, 1984 is in the running for my favorite piece of fiction ever, Orwell wrote a number of other works that are deserving of the spotlight, Down and Out in Paris and London, not least among them. At age 25, Orwell left his job and upwardly mobile station as a police officer in what was then British Burma and moved to Paris with literary intentions. These intentions were not fully realized in the economic sense, and Orwell's down period is hastened when he is robbed by a fellow lodger at his boarding house. This sent him towards and then into poverty, something I have never even come close to. But, driven to near starvation, he eventually finds work in what we would now refer to as the service industry, as a low-level employee in one of the most expensive hotels in Paris, which he dubs Hotel X. And it is here that his path and mine converge in a way. He becomes immersed in the world of fine dining, that is, the literal underworld of the workers who make fine dining possible for those who can afford it. There are a lot of interesting topics to discuss here, but what strikes me most about Orwell's recollection of his time at Hotel X is how unbelievably similar restaurant work was 100 years ago. I cannot think of another line of work that has changed so little from his day to ours, and I challenge the viewers of NYC Foodways to do so. Allow me to elaborate. The Hotel X was a vast, grandiose place with a classical facade, Orwell writes, and at one side a little dark doorway like a rat hole, which was the service entrance. This should sound familiar to anyone who has worked in any large dining establishment. Waiting is a gamble, one of Orwell's waiter co-workers tells him. You may die poor, you may make your fortune in a year. You are not paid wages, you depend on tips. The hourly wage for tipped workers in Louisiana, such as waiters, in the current year is $2.13. Orwell is nominally employed as a plongeur or dishwasher in the kitchen's prep area. In addition to the standard dishwasher's work of washing dishes, Orwell's responsibilities were as follows: making tea, coffee, and chocolate, fetching meals from the kitchen, wines from the cellar, and fruit and so forth from the dining room, slicing bread, making toast, rolling pats of butter, measuring jam, opening milk cans, counting lumps of sugar, boiling eggs, cooking porridge, pounding ice, grinding coffee. This is exactly what food runners and backwaiters do today. Theft of food and drink from Orwell's restaurant was rampant, and it's rampant today. How could it not be in such an exploitative environment? The vulgar, masochistic, and abusive bro culture of restaurants, by and large, hasn't changed in the past 100 years either, unfortunately. The preponderance of immigrants in service work today, in my experience, folks from Eastern Europe and Central America, was the same in the Paris of Orwell's day, but instead they were generally Italians and Russian emigres. Orwell refers to these folks as hardworking people and have put up with their bad luck far better than one can imagine Englishmen of the same class doing. This could be said exactly of the mass of immigrants and economic refugees that make any large American city's service industry tick, and the same of their American counterparts. Speaking of Americans, our countrymen get a bit of a bum rap here, mainly as being low-intelligent spendthrifts, for spending 25 francs on hot salt water, for example, and for, in Orwell's words, knowing nothing whatever about good food. Check out these zingers. They would stuff themselves with disgusting American cereals and eat marmalade at tea, and drink vermouth after dinner, and order
Poulet à la reine.
at 100 francs and then souse it in Worcester sauce. One customer, from Pittsburgh, dined every night in his bedroom on grape nuts, scrambled eggs, and cocoa. Perhaps it hardly matters whether such people are swindled or not. Got 'em. I calculated that one had to walk and run about 15 miles during the day, Orwell writes, and yet the strain of the work was more mental than physical. This is absolutely true. One's mind is numb from overuse following an intense shift at the restaurant. And how about his description of the raw ingredients used at Hotel X? For the most part, the materials of the food were very bad, though the cooks knew how to serve it up in style. The meat was at best ordinary, and as to the vegetables, no good housekeeper would have looked at them in the market. The tea and coffee were of inferior sorts, and the jam was synthetic stuff out of vast, unlabeled tins. Almost all large catering halls and hotel dining rooms today use the same type of stuff. Believe me, I've worked in several. Orwell's description of his neighborhood dive is eerily similar to the shithole service industry dumps I used to frequent during my time in that world. The same cramped quarters, the same cheap drinks, the same sloppy drunks, the same boisterousness, the same lies, the same externalized idiocy masking obvious internalized pain. On Saturday nights, Orwell wrote, everyone was very happy, overwhelmingly certain that the world was a good place and we a notable set of people. Scary stuff, but it gets worse. By 1 o'clock, we were not happy any longer. We felt the joy of the evening wearing thin and called hastily for more bottles. Men grew quarrelsome. The girls were violently kissed and hands thrust into their bosoms, and they made off lest worse should happen. People seized each other by the arm and began long, rambling confessions, and were angry when these were not listened to. God, the number of times I have been drunkenly talked at by people I barely knew at late-night establishments. By 1:30, Orwell continues, the last drop of pleasure had evaporated, leaving nothing but headaches. We perceived that we were not splendid inhabitants of a splendid world, but a crew of underpaid workmen grown squalidly and dismally drunk. On the whole, the 2 hours when one was perfectly and wildly happy seemed worth the subsequent headache. For many men in the quarter, unmarried and with no future to think of, the weekly drinking bout was the one thing that made life worth living. Agony. This book is eminently quotable. Nearly every page contains a passage I'd like to share with you, but unfortunately this is not the place. I can only recommend you pick up a copy yourself. It's relatively short and a blazingly fast read. I do want to read one section of the book here in full. This is where Orwell describes the preparation for and execution of the dinner rush. At 4:45, we went back to the hotel. Till 6:30, there were no orders, and we used this time to polish silver, clean out the coffee urns, and do other odd jobs. Then the grand turmoil of the day started, the dinner hour. I wish I could be Zola for a little while, just to describe that dinner hour. The essence of the situation was that 100 or 200 people were demanding individually different meals of 5 or 6 courses, and that 50 or 60 people had to cook and serve them and clean up the mess afterwards. Anyone with experience of catering will know what that means. And at this time when the work was doubled, the whole staff was tired out, and a number of them were drunk. I could write pages about the scene without giving a true idea of it. The charging to and fro in the narrow passages, the collisions, the yells, the struggling with crates and trays and blocks of ice, the heat, the darkness, the furious festering quarrels which there was no time to fight out, they passed description. Anyone coming into the basement for the first time would have thought himself in a den of maniacs. It was only later, when I understood the working of a hotel, that I saw order in all this chaos. He continues, indeed, the quarrels are a necessary part of the process, for the pace would never be kept up if everyone did not accuse everyone else of idling. It was for this reason that during the rush hours the whole staff raged and cursed like demons. But we are not losing our heads and wasting time. We were just stimulating one another for the effort of packing 4 hours' work into 2 hours. Facts. What keeps a hotel going, Orwell states, and this is accurate, is the fact that the employees take a genuine pride in their work, beastly and silly though it is. If a man idles, the others soon find him out and conspire against him to get him sacked. Cooks, waiters, and dishwashers differ greatly in outlook, but they are all alike in being proud of their efficiency. Dishwashers, low as they are, also have a kind of pride. It is the pride of the drudge, the man who is equal to no matter of what quantity of work. At that level, the mere power to go on working like an ox is about the only virtue attainable. This
Esprit de corps.
of service workers should be familiar and strangely happy notion for those of us who have worked in the service industry. It's pretty much all one has, really, in such an awful work environment. Orwell refers repeatedly to the
Boulot.
of fine dining.
Boulot.
Transliterally as gig, but it describes here the show that must be put on for guests, a show that could not be more different than the reality of what occurs behind closed doors. The show of cleanliness versus the unseen filth of the prep area, the show of calm on the restaurant floor versus the unseen chaos of the kitchen, the show of professional waiters and staff versus the debaucherous, dirtbag, alcoholic behavior they will plunge into directly following their shift. The show of pretty much everything customer-facing is a mirror image of the unseen somewhere else. But this intense duality can be instructional as well, and Orwell learned some valuable existential lessons during his time in the dish pit, lessons that most white-collar workers will, unfairly, never have to learn. Work in the hotel taught me the true value of sleep, Orwell observes, just as being hungry taught me the true value of food. And that is something to write home about. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another episode of NYC Foodways. Peace.